2 weeks ago, I said to you this: everyone has a worldview, a way you put the world together, a set of beliefs by which you interpret reality. Every one of us has a worldview. Now, there are basically 5 sources that shape your worldview. 5 major sources that will shape your worldview. Here they are on the screen: culture, science, the Bible, Christian tradition, if you were raised in a certain Christian tradition, and personal experience. Now, as you look at those 5 sources, let me ask you a question. Which of those 5 would be the primary shaper of your worldview? Which of those 5 would be the primary shaper of your worldview, especially when it comes to the area of human sexuality? I was talking to some people recently. They were all Christians, and we were talking about this. And they said that their primary shaper was either Christian tradition, the Christian tradition they grew up in, or their personal experience, or both. And that didn't shock me that they didn't say the Bible, because George Barna, who's done a lot of research on Christian trends in the United States, did some research and found that only 2% of North American Christ followers have a biblical worldview as their foundation for living. And yet, as Christ followers, isn't the Bible supposed to be the primary shaper of our lives? In the Bible, we find the story that explains all other stories. In the Bible, we find the grand or meta-narrative, the story that explains life to us. In the Bible, we find a story that each and every one of us are a part of. A story that should shape both our lives and our worldview. And so, let's review this grand story. It's important when we think about human sexuality that we understand the story that the Bible from beginning to end tells. The story starts in chapter 1. In chapter 1 of this story, God creates. In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. God created the entire cosmos, and human beings were the crown of His creation. And as you've heard me say before, if you've been at Sandwich for a while, we were created for 4 relationships. We were created to have a relationship with God, a dynamic, personal relationship with God, where we experience His presence in our lives. We are created to have a relationship with ourselves. We are created to be whole, complete people. We are created to have a relationship with other human beings. We were created for loving, harmonious relationships with other people. We are also created to steward creation. We're created to have a relationship with the creation that we're to steward. And in Genesis 1:31, God looked at all He created and He said it was very good. In chapter 2 of the story that explains all other stories, things go sideways. I don't have time this morning to go into detail, but early in the human story, the first couple made the choice to disobey God and go their own way. And that choice changed everything. Thus today, we live in a fallen and broken world. And while we are created to be whole, complete people, every single one of us is broken. Every one of us is dysfunctional to some degree or another. And while we are created to have loving, harmonious relationships with others, every single one of us knows the pain of a broken relationship. And while we're created to have this amazing relationship with God, down through time, humans have known that the relationship is broken. That there's a chasm between God and humanity. That's what religion is all about. Religion is humanity's attempt to bridge that gap. And while we were created to steward creation, history tells us we've done a really good job at exploiting it. In chapter 2, we find the world fallen and broken. But in chapter 3 of this story, God sets out to redeem or restore what He created. His goal is the restoration of all creation. We sometimes forget that, but God's goal is the restoration of all creation. Peter puts it well in Acts 3:21 when he says, he must remain in heaven until the time comes for God to restore everything. In the Old Testament, God initiated His redemptive plan. And at the end of the Old Testament, we find the Israelites waiting for the Messiah to come and bring about liberation and restoration. And then, onto the scene steps Jesus. And Jesus came announcing that God's kingdom had come. Luke 8:1. After this, Jesus traveled about from one town and village to another, proclaiming the good news, proclaiming the gospel of God's, the kingdom of God. Jesus came as the kingdom bringer, the liberator, the Messiah. But Jesus was not the kind of king or Messiah the Jewish people expected. He was not the freedom fighter that would bring about the defeat of the Romans and make Israel great again. He was not the kind of Messiah the Jewish people had been waiting for. And so over time, opposition mounted until finally Jesus was arrested and crucified. And there on that cross, Jesus took upon Himself all the sin and the brokenness of the world, past, present, future, so the world might be healed and restored. Because of Christ's death and resurrection, the cross has become a doorway into His kingdom. And now, through the cross, anyone can enter His kingdom. Because of the cross, anyone can come into His kingdom and experience life in Him. Experience the presence and the power of God in their life. And when you come into the kingdom, you experience forgiveness to the depths of your soul. When you come into the kingdom, your identity is changed. Paul says when you come into the kingdom, you are a new creation. You no longer identify yourself as a sinner. You now identify yourself as a saint. You know you are now a son or a daughter of the Most High God. If you're a Christ follower, you should never identify yourself as straight or gay or trans or bi. That should never be your primary identity. If you're a Christ follower, your primary identity is a beloved child of the Most High God. And when you enter into the kingdom, you begin a journey towards wholeness. Once again, when you come into the kingdom, your relationship with God is restored. You can now know His presence. When you come into the kingdom, you become a person on a journey towards wholeness. God wants to remake you into a whole person. When you come into the kingdom, God wants to restore fractured relationships in your life. He wants to pour His forgiveness into your life so you can pour it into your relationships. And as Christ followers in His kingdom, we are called to steward well creation. And that brings us to chapter 4. It's the chapter we find ourselves living in. Since the whole world belongs to God, and since the whole world is fallen, the whole world needs to be redeemed. Every last person and place and organization. And so God created a community called the church, a movement of people to be on a restorative, redemptive mission with Him. And this is the chapter, as I mentioned, that we're in. We live between God's D-Day, the cross and resurrection, and God's victory day, a new heaven and a new earth. And that's chapter 5 of this grand story. It's the final chapter. It's when Jesus returns. And when He returns, He will bring about the renewal of all things. The kingdom will come in all its fullness. Sin, evil, and their effects will be destroyed, and there will be a new heaven and a new earth. That's the story that should shape our worldview as Christ followers. That's the grand story. The story that explains all other stories. The story we find ourselves in. And that should be our worldview as followers of Jesus. And today what I want to do in the time I have left is look at human sexuality in light of this story. So let's go back to chapter 1 of the story. God creates. Creation is important because it reveals what life was like before the fall, when things were very good. Therefore, we should consider what the creation story tells us or teaches us about human sexuality. Let's look at Genesis 1:26. Then God said, "Let us make mankind in our image, in our likeness, so that they may rule over the fish in the sea and the birds in the sky, over the livestock and all the wild animals, and over all the creatures that move along the ground." Every single person bears God's image. Now that image is profoundly marred, but nevertheless, every person bears God's image, which means every single person has incredible value and worth. Every person. Whether you're gay, whether you're straight, whether you're bi, whether you're whatever, you have incredible worth and value because you're created in the image of God. Do you believe that? Do you live that? Do you see people that way? The way you see people greatly impacts how you treat them. And when you start seeing people as created in the image of God, meaning they have incredible value and worth, it will deeply affect how you treat those people. Let me read verse 26 and then 27. Then God said, "Let us make mankind in our image and in our likeness, so that they may rule over the fish in the sea and the birds in the sky, over the livestock and all the wild animals, and over all the creatures that move along the ground." So God created mankind in His own image. In the image of God, He created them, male and female, He created them. When God creates a creature in His own image, He didn't create a solitary, genderless individual. He created a complementary pair, male and female. We are not just human beings. We are males and females. Humanity is sexed. That's the way God created us. And then it says in verse 28, God blessed them and said to them, "Be fruitful and increase in number. Fill the earth and subdue it. Rule over the fish in the sea and the birds in the sky and over every living creature that moves on the ground." Notice the roles God gave. Rule over. That's probably a bad way to interpret it. What we're literally meaning here is steward. We're to steward creation. We're to rule over. We're to steward creation. And then be fruitful and increase in numbers. In other words, have lots of sex and populate the world. Who says God's a killjoy, right? Understand this. Sex is a good gift from God. Sex is a good gift from God. And then as the story moves from Genesis 1 to Genesis 2, it zooms in from the big picture of Genesis 1 to a close-up account of two individual human beings in Genesis 2. Genesis 2, verse 18. The Lord said, "It is not good for man to be alone. I will make a helper suitable for him." God said everything was good except Adam being alone. That was not good. Again, as human beings, we're created to be in relationship. So God said, "I will make a helper suitable for him." The Hebrew word, the Old Testament was written originally in Hebrew. The Hebrew word translated suitable is used only here in the Old Testament. It's a word that conveys both similarity and dissimilarity. Eve is a human. That is why she is like or similar to Adam. But she is female, not male, meaning she is dissimilar or different than Adam. Adam did not need just another human. He needed a different sort of human. So God created Eve to be different from Adam, so she could complement him. That's what the word helper there means. Helper does not mean subservient slave. What helper means is someone that complements you. God created Eve to complement or complete Adam. They physically fit together, emotionally, spiritually, cognitively, and a bunch of other ways. Adam and Eve complement or complete one another. Now go down to verse 23. The man said, "This is now bone of my bones and flesh of my flesh. She shall be called woman, for she was taken out of man." The man and woman were brought together, and their new relationship was sealed with a covenant commitment. A covenant is a binding commitment made by the giving of an oath or a vow. When Adam said, "This is now bone of my bones and flesh of my flesh," that phrase is an ancient oath of loyalty. Bone of my bones, flesh of my flesh is an ancient oath of loyalty. So when Adam spoke those words to Eve, he was making an oath of loyalty to her. He was making a covenant commitment with her. And Adam and Eve's relationship becomes the foundation for verse 24. In Genesis 2:24, we are no longer just talking about Adam and Eve. We are talking about God's basic design for marriage, which is why this verse, verse 24, is quoted several times in the New Testament. Genesis 2:24 says this: "That is why a man leaves his father and mother and is united to his wife, and they become one flesh." A man leaves his father and mother. Now you need to understand, in the Mideast tradition, what would happen is a woman would leave her family and join her husband's family. And what God is saying is, no. Not only does the wife need to leave, but the husband also needs to leave and create a new family unit. That is why a man leaves his wife and mother and is united to his wife. United in the Hebrew literally means to glue together. When a couple share their vows with one another on their wedding day, they are making a covenant commitment to each other. A faithful, through thick and thin, good until the grave commitment to one another. And when they do that, when they share their vows on their wedding day, something mysterious happens. Something we don't understand happens. Look at Matthew 19:6. "So they are no longer two but one." This is Jesus speaking. "Therefore, what God has joined together, let no one separate." On your wedding day, if you're married, when you shared your vows, God glued you together. Do you understand now why divorce is so painful? Because it's pulling apart something God has glued together. That is why a man leaves his father and mother and is united to his wife, and the two become one flesh. God not only created males and females with unique and glorious differences, He also created them for each other. Think about it for a minute. Eve was created out of Adam, made from his body. Thus, their one flesh union is really a reunion. A joining together of that which originally had been one. Now, as we will see next week, the joining together of two, the becoming of one flesh, is much more than just the joining of two physical bodies. It is that, but it is very much more than that. We'll see that next week. Today, I want us to think of one flesh in its most basic form, the joining together of two physical bodies. And here's what I want to understand in that basic sense of one flesh. The one flesh union is meant to consummate and set apart a marriage. Sexual intercourse has historically been understood as a way to consummate a marriage. Thus, if you think about it, the one flesh union sets a relationship apart from all other relationships. It binds people together in a unique way, and intuitively we know this. Also, the physical one flesh union is meant to procreate. Sexual intercourse is a means by which human life on earth continues, and it's a means by which human life begins. Have you ever thought about that? That we as human beings are co-creators with the Creator. Isn't that awesome? We are co-creators with the Creator. When you and your spouse have a baby, you're co-creating something that will last for eternity. Isn't that incredible? God's given you the privilege of creating something that will last for eternity. We're co-creators with God. The one flesh union is also meant to demonstrate love. When two people love each other, they want to express their love in visible ways, obviously. And sexual intimacy is not the only way, but it's a natural way to express love. We see this clearly displayed in the Old Testament book, Song of Songs. And also that one flesh physical union is meant to create pleasure. The reality is, there are certain parts of the human body that serve no other function than for sexual pleasure. God created us that way. Pleasure is a legitimate part of His good gift of sex. And then look at verse 25. I love verse 25. Adam and his wife were both naked, and they felt no shame. Now, they were naked and unashamed. We today in our fallen world, we think naked and shame go together. Because that's what happened when sin entered in. But Adam and Eve were naked and they felt no shame. Meaning they were absolutely transparent with one another. No secrets, no lies, no shame. They knew each other deeply and intimately. They lived truthfully and they trusted each other fully. They could literally live naked and unashamed. That wouldn't work so well today. But it did work back then. So let's summarize. In Genesis 1, we see God created humans in His image. He created the male and females. Humanity is sexed. They were given two roles, to steward creation and to be fruitful and multiply. And God gave us the good gift of sex. In Genesis 2, we see that God created Eve different from Adam. We also see that God's basic design for marriage involves creating a new family union, a covenant commitment, two sexually different persons becoming one flesh. And it also involves a degree of vulnerability. Genesis 1 and 2 creates the foundation for the church's view of sexuality. A view that has been in place from the 4th century to the mid-20th century. It's only been in the last 50 years that we've really questioned the traditional view of sexuality. A view that says humans were created in God's image as male and females, and that marriage is a covenant relationship, a one flesh union between two sexually different persons, a man and a woman. A view that says sex is God's gift, but is only to be enjoyed in the marriage relationship. The traditional view comes right from creation, from Genesis 1 and 2, before the fall. But we don't live in a pre-fall world. We live in a fallen world in which sin has impacted everything, including our human relationships, including our humanity, including our human sexuality. We live in a Genesis 3 world, not a Genesis 1-2 world. Today, everyone's sexuality is broken and disordered to one degree or another. Today, some Christ followers speak as if heterosexual sexuality is innocent, while LGBTQ sexuality is broken, damaged, and sinful. Listen, all our sexual orientation does is define what our area of sexual temptation or potential dysfunction will be. The truth is, in our fallen world, no one has sexual innocence. Everyone's sexuality is broken in different ways. Today, no one has a perfect Genesis 1-2 sexuality. Now, having said all that, let's not forget chapter 3 of the great story, right? Because in chapter 3, Jesus came to redeem and restore and heal and transform what has been torn apart by sin. His body was broken for us so that our body might be mended by Him. Jesus came and sacrificed so we could be on a journey towards wholeness in all areas of our life, including the sexual area. And that brings us to chapter 4. Again, that's the chapter that we're living in today in the 21st century. This is the chapter where we engage the issues, where we ask the tough questions. Questions like this. Just because the first human marriage was between a man and a woman, does that mean that all marriages throughout all time must be between a man and a woman? That's a question the church needs to answer. Here's another one. With 80% of 18 to 29-year-old evangelical Christ followers engaging in premarital sex, is the traditional Christian premarriage sex ethic still valid today? Here's another one. There's the conservative Christian traditional way of looking at sexuality, and there's the liberal Christian affirming way of looking at sexuality. The question is there another way? A third way to look at sexuality so that it honors God, blesses relationships, and is good news to the world? One more. There's lots, but I'm just giving you a taste. How should the church deal with its own contradictory behavior? How should the church deal with its own contradictory behavior? Let me give you an example. You can see what I'm talking about. We won't talk about our church. We'll talk about a fictitious church called Joy Christian Fellowship. Okay? So hopefully they're joyful. But Joy Christian Fellowship. And one day into Joy Christian Fellowship comes Mark and Sam. Mark and Sam are Christ followers who love Jesus, and they're married and in a gay relationship. And they start coming to Joy Christian Fellowship, and they really like it. And so they go meet the pastor. And they say, Pastor, let us tell you our story. We're both gay men, and we got married 4 years ago, and we love Jesus, and we just love your church, and we want to know how we can serve in your church. And the pastor says, well, actually, as a gay married couple, you're welcome to attend our church, but our church views gay marriage is a sin. So we see your lifestyle as sinful, and because of that, we can't have you serve in the church. You're welcome to attend, but you can't serve. And they say, okay, and they leave. A couple of days later, another couple comes into the pastor's office to meet with him. And their names are Betty and Mike. And they say, Pastor, we've been coming to your church for a few months, and we just love it. Pastor says, well, Mike and Betty, tell me your story. And they said, well, several years ago, we were married to other people, but we both got divorced. And then we found each other and we remarried, and we've been married for 7 years. And we love Jesus, and we just love this church. How can we get involved? And the pastor says, well, that's great. We'd love to get you involved. So a few weeks later, Mike is serving on the finance team, and Betty is teaching Sunday school. Anyone see a contradiction there? If you don't, let me explain it to you. The pastor says to the gay couple, Your lifestyle is sinful. Your marriage is sinful, so you can come, but you can't serve in our church even though you both love Jesus. In the Gospels, Jesus never, ever spoke about gay marriage. He never spoke about homosexuality. There's reasons for that. We'll get to that in a few weeks. But he never addressed the issue. Over here are Mike and Betty. Mike and Betty divorced and got remarried. Jesus says clearly in Luke that if people who are divorced get remarried, they are living in adultery. Last time I checked, adultery is sinful. So, according to what Jesus said very directly, this couple who are remarried are living in a sinful relationship. And yet the pastor says, we'll turn a blind eye to that and we'll let you serve. Do you see the contradiction now? How do we deal with that? What do we do with that? Do you understand why the LGBTQ community looks at us and says, you're hypocritical? They have a point. How do we wrestle with that? I'm a pastor that's remarried divorced people. How do I wrestle with that? We start dealing with the issues next week. So come back. I'll get you thinking.